Morag, welcome to the Transform with MG podcast. I am beyond excited to have you on and have a chat for many reasons. One of them is kind of selfish because I feel like we are due a long catch up, but also because you are filled with knowledge when it comes to taking a holistic approach to helping women achieve confidence and strength and empowering women to take up space. So, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I agree, it's been well overdue for a catch up, but absolutely cannot wait to dive in and chat a little bit more about it.
So obviously your job entails helping women to curate better relationship with food and with their bodies and empower them to take up space and be proud of who they are. But I know that you yourself struggled with body image from early childhood days. And I feel like a lot of people look at coaches, personal trainers, and think that they are super confident and that they are content with their body image. But it's not always like that. The reality is that for many of them, the reason why they are in that space helping other people is because they had like struggles
Mm.
themselves. So tell me
Mm.
what impact had like your relationship with your body in your early childhood days, and I guess how that
Mm.
transferred into your teenage years and even like early 20s.
Yeah, oh gosh, that's a big question. So I think as much as it's fairly normal for a lot of women to go through these cycles, I don't think it should be normalized. And that's one of the first things that I always talk about with any of my clients or any of the women that I speak to, in the sense that even though it's commonplace to have struggles with food, exercise, even like body image, it's not something that you necessarily then have to settle for or to accept as part of your life and your lifestyle. So I've been in this industry for well over 10 years now. And in that time, I've gone through various iterations of being a coach. I worked in kind of like swimming and performance. I've gone through sport and exercise science at university, then moving into like GP referral and rehabilitation, all the way through that, having a high emphasis on longevity, strength, health as a forefront, because if we don't have that, then it can be very difficult to do everything else that we want to do and to achieve in life. And I think it's one of the understated cornerstones of wealth that we don't actually always think about, is how we actually then feel on an energetic daily basis. So that's kind of, I guess, my little backstory in terms of like where I've been in the industry. But absolutely, like you mentioned, a lot of us come from humble beginnings, but beginnings that maybe had a lot of turmoil at the same time. So I remember growing up, and even through to my early 20s, I've always had a very turbulent relationship when it came to food, to exercise, to body image, and to then in itself also thinking along the lines of self-worth. And it goes back as early as now, if you're from Scotland, you'll understand like primary school, secondary school. If you're from England or elsewhere, you maybe have a slightly different tier of system where there's like three schools that you go to. But as early as probably like around the age of 10, if not younger than that, I was aware of different body types, of the change of that, clothes sizes, and being around food, I developed like secret eating behaviors and habits. Um, Moving up when I got a little bit older, so this is obviously before like puberty, I got to the point of, again, having disordered behaviors with food, secret eating, binge eating, not knowing what it was at the time. I was always a fairly active child, but I also struggled with my weight as well. So it would be a case of going through yo-yo cycles and never really having a set point in the sense of an equilibrium or a foundation of standardized behaviors, let's say. Going into my teenage years, I was a swimmer. So looking into things from a performance-based standpoint. I found that my relationship with food and with exercise in those years became, let's say, more turbulent because I started to notice the impact of either doing more exercise or consuming less food or vice versa on how that then would manifest in a body composition, let's say. And also, it would also change the way that I felt about myself when it came to interactions with other people. And I think a lot of the time as we're growing up, obviously we want to develop friendships, we want to be part of the crowd, be connected and be social. And I noticed that the way that I was viewing things through the lens was my belief system held, if I am a certain way, it's going to mean X or it's going to mean Y. So it drove me into those behaviors a little bit more. Coming into then like performance and swimming, I got to a point where I couldn't really progress much further because my eating habits were holding me back. I wasn't able to fuel myself appropriately. And I'm very, very lucky that I actually didn't develop, when I look back on it retrospectively, HA or hypothalamic amenorrhea or red S, just because of the amount of expenditure that I was going through and the patterns of which I was then fueling myself in my body. So fast forward, we're then going to university. I had stopped swimming, and I think like a lot of young athletes, when maybe you abruptly stop sport, there is this shift again where maybe the expenditure of training isn't there where it used to be. Food consumption continues to be where it was, and there's again a switch. So even though I was studying sports and exercise science at the time, my weight again yo-yoed, body composition changed. And it took me to going through past my degree into my early 20s to starting to look at actually what is the root cause of why I'm going through these cycles. It took to addressing how I felt about myself, my relationship with food, and also it took to investing in coaches, but not just any coach, like coaches that actually had experience with working with relationship with food, with working with like the mindset work and the lenses that you're viewing things. It took to hiring other mentors, going through therapy, lots of things, lots of reading, lots of research to now be able to be in the point where I am now, where I feel like I have definitely come to terms with body image. I'm in a position where I now lead other women through journeys who maybe they have had a very turbulent past themselves, who've maybe not had the greatest relationship with exercise. And yeah, we're now out the other side and continuing to work on it on a daily basis. I don't know if there's anything else you want to go into there, Martina.
No, that's amazing. There's a lot to unpack. I definitely want to go down the route of what do you feel has led you to using food in a toxic way from the early days? Like, do you feel that stems from the people you were around in terms of like family, or was there like an external pressure, maybe peer pressure, especially when you went into competitive swimming?
So I think so the age that say the age that I grew up in, the internet wasn't necessarily such a big thing when I was maybe like kind of 10, 11, 12. Maybe it was starting to kind of pick up traction. So a lot of what I saw was tabloid newspapers, magazines, TV, like kind of like more gossipy shows, like those sorts of things. As well as obviously friends and family members in terms of behaviors and thoughts and their own belief systems. And I can reflect on it now and I can see where my eating patterns at that age came from. And it was from the women closest to me and the women that I love, because obviously I can still love them and understand that what they were going through at that time was not a reflection on them. It's just the way that they believed that they also had to be. And it led to, like I say, secretive eating, feelings of guilt and shame around eating certain foods. And it also led to the utilization of exercise as a way to kind of like try to manage body composition as well.
Yeah, and what impact do you feel that that had on you, I suppose, mentally as well? Because you
Mm.
went through a lot of years of having that negative self-talk where you thought food is punishment, exercise is used as a way to change body composition. How do you feel that impacted you mentally?
I think it had a really profound impact, and it actually shaped a lot of the decisions that I made from a very young age. And it shaped a lot of the relationships that I then allowed into my life as well. So growing up, I potentially felt like I isolated myself a little bit more. Um, I would find that I felt I had to look a certain way before going out to social events and those sorts of things. So there was very high pressure on that. Um, moving up and through into, again, say like relationships. Again, retrospectively looking back on it, I can now see that because of feeling like I had to be externally maybe a certain way or exhibit certain traits, that would then mean that I would attract in um, the level of love, care, and companionship that I wanted to see and to have in life as well. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case because I wasn't at that time able to discern the difference between what was a strong relationship and what wasn't. And a lot of that came back to, again, sense of belief in self and sense of belief in independence in a way as well. And when I mean sense of independence, I definitely agree that there's a difference between toxic independency where you can't rely on anybody and you've got to make your way, but also independence in a sense of grounding and being able to be okay in your own space and being able to be okay with your own presence and being able to be okay with your own company for extended periods of time. Like I was constantly running away from all of that, and I was disguising it with excessive training, with utilizing food and whatever avenue that was. And yeah, it led to some interesting decisions, let's say.
And do you feel like there was a trigger point where you thought, okay, enough is enough, like I need to make a change? Because I feel a
Mm.
lot of people are in similar situations, but they sort of get comfort out of the pain that they're putting themselves through, as in, like, maybe it's a fear of changing, but it takes them to kind of get down to like rock bottom and tell themselves, okay, enough is enough. Like, I need to make a change because I cannot go on living my life like this. Was there a point like this
Mm.
for you?
There was a point, and it was actually like well, before lockdowns happened. So way before 2019, it's probably about 2018, 2017. And I got to a point where I'd kind of done the usual thing of I'm going to take control of it this year. This year's going to be it, and go on some ridiculous, all encompassing regime that lasted maybe like 3 weeks, burnt out, all of those wonderful things. And I decided that enough was enough. And that was the first time that I even looked into hiring a coach and looking at hiring some external help to take me through something. So I couldn't be the person in charge of what I was going to do, if that makes sense. So I was not necessarily abdicating responsibility, but it was the first time that I decided, right, I need some help. I'm going to go do it. That was probably the point at which I had decided enough was enough. And that was at the point where I had moved up to my heaviest weight that I've ever been at, about 220 pounds. And I was in a position where I was training other people. I was a personal trainer and a coach for a vast array of clients who were all seeing amazing success. But even though that was happening for them, I wasn't able to then implement it for myself because I was working ridiculous hours. I was tired, and I was just kind of like putting my own needs on a back burner. So that was the point where I guess I kind of went, nope, enough's enough. I need to take control of this. And yeah, looked at external help.
So, alongside the external help, can you talk us through some maybe specifics in terms of like what steps you have taken to improve your body image? And I guess for anyone listening that does really struggle with being acceptant of their bodies, how
Mm.
you overcame that or got to a place where, you are body acceptant, I suppose, or even like body neutral.
Mm, definitely. And I think it's important to note that it didn't happen straight away. So when I first got help in the sense of hired an external coach, I did it with a very strong aesthetic goal in mind and a very strong, I need to change the way that I'm looking after myself in the sense of body composition standpoint. As I know that a lot of women who are listening back to this will probably feel that they've gotten to that point too. And a lot of what their change starts from is a discomfort or a desire to change a physical aspect. And that's not necessarily a wrong decision because it's led me down the journey and to where I am now, which is a beautiful thing. But I do understand and know that looking back, if I could change certain aspects, I definitely would. So when this journey started, again, like I say, it was a very strong focus on the external. And I got to a certain point where I'd done a photo shoot and all the emotions were amazingly high. And then I went, you know what? I've always said that I'm going to compete. I always said I was going to do like a bodybuilding show. And I'd always kind of put it off as that, oh, it might happen to me one day, might not, very fluid with that goal setting. It was never like, I'm going in, I'm definitely doing that. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and I'm going to commit to doing this. So over the course of probably 2 years, not even that, it was like 2018 to 2019. So yeah, a year, maybe just over a year. I went from 220 down to about 120 pounds over the course of a year. Now, if anybody's thinking about that in terms of then the rate of loss or the rate of change, it's very rapid and it's very quick. And what that meant I had to do at that point was a lot of cardiovascular activity, a lot of heavy restriction on food. And again, it was coming into this bodybuilding prep where I started to destroy my relationship with food all over again. So I had developed better habits when I was going through my initial change, let's say my initial transition from when I'd said, I've decided I've had enough and I'm going to take control, to getting to a point where through that dieting phase, let's say, there was inclusivity of foods, there was more balance, there was a greater degree of flexibility and confidence that I was able to incorporate certain foods without necessarily the fear of weight regain and those sorts of things. However, the change going from that position to having the goal of then stepping on stage and competing obviously is two very different things. They're two very and distinct things as well, which is where I also think it's important for anybody who's listening to this to understand what your goals are moving into any change when it comes to taking control of your health and your wellness. Is it something that you're looking to do in the sense of take bodybuilding very, very seriously and step on a stage? Or are you looking to improve more energy in your life and your lifestyle? Is it that you are looking to be able to spend better quality time with your friends, families, and loved ones? And if that is the case, then there are two very distinct pathways of which you can take to be able to get there. So I know that that was a bit of a rabbit hole, but anyways, coming back into the bodybuilding side of things, that was when I found that my patterns and compulsive behaviors got very, very dialed up and very amplified because of the feedback that I was receiving. Obviously, the goal and purpose of the bodybuilding show is to step on stage shredded, to be able to compete against other people, which is, again, like a subjective placing to say, okay, well, you're first, you're second, and you're third. Again, there's absolutely nothing wrong if that's the direction you want to go in. But at the end of the day, that is what it is. So there's a very high focus on aesthetics. So when you're highly focused on aesthetics and you're highly focused on then every single variable that you're doing to be able to bring a certain quote unquote look, that in itself is very problematic because you can then introduce reactive behaviors. So if that's a case of, binge restrict behavior, binge purge behavior, and when I'm talking about this, I appreciate obviously this can be quite triggering for other people as well. Like binge purge, what I mean by that is not necessarily just kind of like food, but it can also be exercise as well. When there's a really high retaliatory behavior in place of a previous action and then how you feel about it, or if you're on a specific deadline, it can incite a lot of that. So I'd say that my transition to bodybuilding stage was not great. Was not from a place of I feel really empowered and I'm going to do this. It was more of a case of trying to prove a point to myself to be able to get there. It was not helpful in the sense of improving any sort of relationship with food and exercise at that point, because I had no opportunity for a break as well. So it was literally like straight in, like no break, keep going, type attitude and type approach. So looking back, I would definitely say having breaks is a very important thing. But you can kind of see where that journey is kind of like led. So following from that, again, that was a time where I lost my cycle actually. So that was the first time that I'd known that I'd lost my cycle for a number of months, just with the amount of energy expenditure and relative energy deficit that I had gone through to get to that point in that stage. At that time as well, I was not in a supportive place in terms of relationships, and it all like snowballed after that bodybuilding show. So again, there was a rebound out, and then I ended up stabilizing in a position where I hadn't gone back to square one, but I definitely wasn't where I was. So that then led, I say, quite nicely into lockdown, where we then were forced to come out of the gyms. We were forced to stay at home. It changed the way that I operated in business, which gave me more time for myself, which allowed me to then have more time to do other research, to set better boundaries, have more control over meal times and those sorts of things. So in terms of life balance, it improved. And over that period of time, that's again where I started to do more work on myself and do more work to be able to start to look after and understand why I'd gone through those previous cycles.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing like that timeline as well, because I think it's important to highlight that, like you said, it's not an overnight thing that you just suddenly develop positive body image. It might take months, it might take years. I suppose one thing that you did mention is losing your cycle, and I think
Mm.
that's the road I'd like to go into. Could you highlight why it's important for women to be concerned that they lose
Mm.
their cycle? Because I feel like it has been portrayed to us that our cycle and periods is something that is just inconvenient, but the cycle plays such an important role. So yeah, I suppose could you like highlight why that should be a concern when a female loses her cycle?
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I don't know about you, but my entire education of it growing up was you bleed once a month, might get some pain, you get pregnant anytime during your cycle. So make sure that you're on contraception or you're being very, very careful, all these sorts of things. And actually, do you know what? Unless you want to get pregnant, then it's no big deal. Like you don't have to worry about it. So I don't know if that's the same information that you got, but
Yeah, totally. I was, sex education hasn't really taught me much about how to slide a condom on a banana. And don't get me wrong, safe sex is important, but, how my female body actually operates and what is happening throughout
Mhm.
those, like, on average 28 days, absolutely
Yeah.
had zero clue until I took proactive action as a health coach to learn it. So I think a lot of females are probably in similar positions unless they have like a biology or like physiology background.
Absolutely. So I would say an easy way to view your menstrual cycle is almost like your monthly report card of how your body is operating. Your cycle is very reflective of the amount of stress you're under or how your body is. I don't use the word performing because performing makes it sound like we always need to be like at this top optimal. But I use performing as in the way that your body is working in its synchronicity of its symphony of hormonal expression, production, and by its nature, the female body is quite a cyclical, has a cyclical physiology. So when we look into the menstrual cycle and why is it so important? So, okay, a lot of people would term the menstrual cycle as the main event is your bleed. It's that menstrual bleed that you maybe get once a month, maybe slightly longer, maybe slightly less, depending on um, your individual physiology. It may not always be the same in terms of consistent every single month, but that's where it gives you a fantastic insight into stress levels, recoverability, and all of those other amazing, wonderful things. The actual main event of your menstrual cycle is probably more like your ovulation, your actual release of an egg from your ovary. Now, most people will have known about like progesterone. We've got multitude of sex hormones. We've got estrogen, progesterone, we've got testosterone as well as females, which is also very important. We produce estrogen, but we only produce progesterone if we actually release an egg, and we get that from like the corpus luteum. So if you imagine on your ovaries, you've got all these little follicles, and over the course of about 90 days, they start to mature, get a little bit bigger, and then one is chosen, and then the egg is released. And it's that release of the egg that then releases progesterone into your body and into your system. Now, if we are not releasing progesterone, we're not releasing that kind of like calming hormone, that one that helps with mood regulation, that helps with like anxiety. And we can tend to find that we actually have a high prevalence towards more anxious behavior, more depressive behavior. But again, that can happen if we're not looking after other external factors as well in terms of our lives and our lifestyles. So it's not kind of like one and the same in that if you don't ovulate or if you do ovulate, you're going to be great with your mood. There's a lot of factors at play. But when we're looking at like female hormones as well, they're really important for tendon, ligament health, joint health, bone health, muscular health. Like we need all of it to be able to live life well. And I think that that's something as well to look into, is like not just living life and existing, but it's living life well and having a system where your sex hormones interplay to the capacity where you have improved recovery, your sleep is good, and all these sorts of things, then can allow you to show up in the world, I think, as the version of yourself that you want to bring forward. I don't know if you've got anything else you want to add to that, Martina.
No, that's such a comprehensive like overview of how the cycle works and obviously paints the importance of it and that, bleeding isn't the main event of it. I suppose
Mhm.
there's so many other things that are going on throughout the cycle that have an impact on our mood, on our energy levels, and how we perform. I can mention perform just like how we optimally operate on daily basis. What have you noticed some of the common causes of why women might lose their cycle then? Or like
Mhm.
period, not get their period.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, and this is a really interesting one because we can get things that are called a withdrawal bleed. So if we're looking at it from a cycle perspective, depending on how in tune you are with your body, and I know that this is now another thing that you've got to kind of like get in tune with and figure out, but it's all part of the journey and growth. If you don't ovulate, you can still have a withdrawal bleed. And a lot of the time as well, that can happen if you're on hormonal contraceptions, hormonal contraceptives as well. It's not definitely you are going to have a withdrawal bleed if you're on hormonal contraceptives, but a lot of the time it can happen. And that's when we can also think that there's nothing wrong and we're still having a period. It's just we're not going to get pregnant because we've had a bleed. And that's then seen as like the kind of like main event. I've gone on a bit of a tangent, Martina. Can you prompt me again with that question that you gave me?
Of course, yes. There's a lot to discuss with the menstrual cycle, so I don't blame you. But do you notice some of the main causes of why women might lose their cycle?
Fabulous. Yes, thank you. So yes, main causes tend to be a chronic state of stress within the body. And this is something that's actually quite buzzwordy at the moment. We hear a lot about stress, we hear a lot about cortisol, but I think it's understanding what that actually then means and what can contribute to it as well. So if we're looking at it from a physiology perspective, ovulation is quite an energy costly process. Even if you're not looking to get pregnant, but the whole process of ovulation, if it was to happen, fertilization and pregnancy, is very energy demanding on the female body. So in order to be in a position to be able to ovulate, the body needs to be in a position where there is relative energy availability, recoverability for that to be able to happen. Now, if we look into the state and pace of life at the moment, a lot of it's very go, go, go. It's high masculine energy driven, goal getter, grind culture, work harder, like all of these sorts of things. But we can also find that there is a high prevalence as well with overexercise and undereating. And it's not just as well with the thought of, well, oh, I eat enough calories. It's also about the micronutrition behind that as well. So if we're looking at it from kind of like a base perspective in the sense of what lifestyle factors can influence menstruation, your sleep is huge. If we think about it from a circadian rhythm standpoint and a hormonal expression standpoint, we have a micro hormonal rhythm every kind of like 24 hours or so where we release cortisol in the morning, and then that kind of like tails off as we then start to convert that to melatonin to be able to then sleep at night. So that's one of the examples of like a cyclical hormonal release that we have as a base standpoint anyway. We then also find that, so if sleep is disrupted, that cyclical clock can be thrown a little bit out of whack. We can also find that anything that threatens to disrupt the body's homeostasis can be perceived as a stressor. And that seems a little bit extreme, especially when you go, girl, okay, literally everything I do could be perceived as a stressor. So it's then about looking at all of the factors to be able to look after your body and to help it to maintain within it. And when I say homeostatic set points, what I mean is the balance levels within the body. So we've got lots of set points within our body. We have a like carbon dioxide set point where it tells our brain to then breathe in and to, breathe. We've got set points for understanding like exercise tolerance and those sorts of things. We've got set points for literally everything. Those are just some examples. But if we find another really common one is like dehydration, like chronic dehydration. It's not going to suddenly like massively impact your cycle as a one-off thing. But if we're combining different factors, like dehydration would be a stressor. Not eating frequently may be a stressor as well. Like intermittent fasting might not be the best strategy for somebody who's experienced menstrual cycle irregularities. Thinking about the way that we're digesting foods can also be a stressor as well. Like if we've got a lot of bloat or digestive problems, if we're finding that our boundaries are really off and we are working until like 9 o'clock at night and then not shutting off and not going to sleep, like all of these sorts of things. So in short, there's a lot that can impact your cycle. But on the flip of that, there's so much that you can enact and control to help support yourself for your cycle as well. Because if we look at every problem or every perceived problem, there's an opportunity to do the best with that situation that we have. So if we're looking at it from the perspective of potentially you're somebody who is experiencing menstrual cycle irregularities at the moment, okay, look at the basics of what you have to do every single day and how can you do that effectively and you can do it well. So like, how can you sleep well? Because that's free for everybody. Like, how can you make sure that you are trying to work with your boundaries? How can you, get outside, get some movement, like all these sorts of things. So yeah, that would be my thoughts to begin with.
I want to touch on stress because that has
Mm,
came up in our conversation numerous of times, and I feel nowadays everyone is either stressed or busy. That, as you said, it's becoming normalized because we
mhm.
live in a society where hustle and grind is glamorized, no days off mentality, masculine adaptations to, like, how we should live. And you know obviously it has an impact on the cycle. It also, you mentioned, has an impact on digestion and bloating, but I never consider stress to be a factor that had a prevalence in like my health and fitness journey. And as a business owner, and even prior to that, as a student, stress has always been in my life. And I feel like it's unrealistic for me to say that I can completely eliminate it. And there's a lot of women that will agree with me, whether they have that they're high achievers or they've kids or they're studying for exams. So would you have some suggestions for myself and women in similar positions where they are highly stressed on daily basis on how they can manage that stress?
Definitely. And I think I absolutely agree with you in that it's completely unrealistic to go, oh, well, we're just not going to be stressed because that's not the way the world works, unfortunately. Um, but what we can do is we can think about the way that we set our days up to be able to regulate our nervous system. So if we're looking at it from a perspective of, okay, stress, anything can be stress. Okay, I don't necessarily want to feel like I have to micromanage every single little thing because, again, that in itself can become a stressor. But what we want to look at is, for example, how many mini pockets of time do you take for yourself every single day? Now, that doesn't have to be 30, 40, 50 minutes at a time. It's thinking about, can you take a minute to work through some breathing techniques? So if we look at so your nervous system's got two states. You've got your sympathetic nervous system, which is kind of like your fight, your flight, your freeze, your fawn. It's kind of like your hyper arousal or your hypo arousal. And you've got your parasympathetic nervous system, which is more your rest, digest, recovery state. Now, when you hear information about calming your nervous system and nervous system regulation, it's not about suppression of the nervous system and kind of throwing yourself into parasympathetic as often as you can. It's about the ability to be nimble in your nervous system and to be able to go into the sympathetic when you need to, but then to come out of it as well and to come back into your rest and digest. Because there would be nothing worse than going into a business meeting, chilled out and being like, yeah, whatever. It's whatever happens. Like, you need to be on your A game. You need to be there. You need to be alert. You need to be focused. So you need that drive of cortisol, that drive of adrenaline, that little bit of edge that gets you kind of like focused and fixated. You need that in your life. But the problem comes in when you're in that state chronically and you're unable to flip out of it. So when we look at bodily regulation from that standpoint, you will find it very difficult to logic yourself out of it. So if you're in a heightened or a lower state, what we have to think about is not necessarily brain down, but body up. You need to get back into your body and you need to be able to send signals to your brain that actually you're okay and you can calm down and you can come out of this heightened state. So a lot of the time that will come in with meditative practice. Now, there's lots of different types of meditation. So if sitting still, being quiet isn't your jam, then you've got walking meditation. You could have yogic meditation where it's like smooth, fluid movements. To be honest, some people may describe gym training and resistance training as meditative, or going out for a run as meditative because they can kind of just get into a little bit of a plod, so there's different ways to switch off. Obviously, each one of those is then going to have its own impact on your body and the way that we release kind of like stress and we're exercising and those sorts of things. But we have to look at the net positive or the net balance of it. So we can either have net positive or net negative. So one of the easiest ways, and I popped it actually up on my Instagram, one of the easiest ways that you can do to help yourself, to calm your system, and it's probably the only way that you can deliberately influence your heart rate, is breath work. It's like the only way you can do it. You can't tell your heart to stop beating so quickly. You can't do that. But what you can do is you can change the pressures in your rib cage and your thorax by expanding your lungs and obviously taking slower breaths, taking spaces between your breaths as well. And that in itself can help to slow the body down. And it's that act of slowing the body down that can bring us down out of that hyper or hypoarousal state. So that would be one of the things that I would say on a daily basis. If you don't have time to train, fine. That's a-okay. Maybe some point during that week, I would definitely recommend it. But breath during the day, not starting your day in a heightened state is really helpful. I appreciate if you've got kids and kids have woken you up at 5 a.m., you maybe don't have a choice in the matter, but potentially you pick another time during that day to just have some time aside for yourself. In one study, they task or habit stacked. So people who were driving to work did breath work in the car. It's not that you have to set aside specific time in a pocket of this is 10 minutes where I'm sat at home doing this. It's about thinking, how can I incorporate it in my life that allows me to use these tools, but in a way that doesn't then feel like I've got to try and like jam everything in.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I love how realistic you are with that as well, because I feel the recommendations you see online in terms of like managing stress can be a lot for somebody with that is super busy. Even for myself, I understand now how negatively chronic stress can impact me both mentally and physically. But then there's still, and I know I should like meditate, but there's still that barrier of like, oh, I cannot sit there with my legs crossed for half an hour and I come to myself. So, the fact that you mentioned it doesn't have to be like this. You can be walking, you can be doing yoga, you can be even driving to work and focus
Mhm.
on your breathing or taking the pockets of time throughout the day to just focus
Yeah.
on your breath. I think that is really realistic for most people that do live busy lifestyles.
Definitely. I mean, like even your cup of coffee, your cup of tea, like engaging the senses. And that's actually a really good point for digestion as well. But like smell that coffee. Like for me, first thing in the morning, that little moment where I'm like, oh yeah, like that in itself could be meditative, but the idea is that you're calming down, you're enjoying the moment and you're just staying in the present.
I love how you mentioned digestion and stress because this is something that I wanted to get into. So you're saying that my bloating issues might not actually be a result of specific foods. It can be actually things like stress as well.
It can be, it definitely. So if we're looking at digestion and bloating and the pace of life and lifestyle that we lead, I think it's really important to look at your variables to begin with. So, what I mean by that is the process of digestion happens in that rest and digest state to an effective degree. When we are in that sympathetic state, what we'll find that we are mobilizing, we're getting ready for action. And that's not a position where we're then releasing digestive juices and enzymes and those sorts of things to digest food, because you wouldn't be chomping down on a 3-course meal whilst you're running away from a saber-toothed tiger. It just wouldn't happen. It's like complete opposite. Like you want as much blood diverted to the periphery as possible to be ready to kind of like move and go. I know that was a very extreme example. I hope no one's got saber-toothed tigers these days. You never know. But what we want to start with when it comes to digestion is looking from a top-down approach. I know that I've just said that you can't out logic or outthink your way out of like a stressful state within the body. But we have to think about it from like a brain perspective down. So if your brain is signaling and sending out signals, hormones, like chemicals to your body to say, we are going to be running, we need to be alert, we need to be this, we need to be that. It's not sending out the signals to then go, actually, do you know what? We're going to sit down and we're going to eat and we're going to digest. So that's one of the first things, is to consider the activity of parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is like the wandering nerve. It travels brain down through the gut. And if we are not working with that, then we can find that digestion can be compromised, and for a number of reasons. The first being when we are in a rush. So the process of digestion starts on the plate. And I know that sounds really weird, but it starts on the plate because we're using our senses to engage our brain and to tell it, oh, there's some really great food coming. Okay. Like, you know, if you walk past a bakery in the morning and you get that like smell of sourdough, like your mouth starts watering, it's saliva production. So that in itself is one of the first stages of digestion. It's like saliva production, and it's also the act of chewing your food. So if you are a super busy person, super busy woman who is knacking her food down, and you haven't given your body a chance to produce enough saliva to mix your DNA and other digestive enzymes in with that food before you swallow it, that's when we can start to see problems in the sense of either maldigestion, or we can sort of see a little bit of reactivity because we haven't had the opportunity to mix, I'd say, our own DNA, like enzymes and everything else. There's lots of other components to it in that bolus before it goes down. So that's one consideration. The second one is the actual like mechanical state of chewing. So not that you want to chew your food down till it's necessarily like baby paste in your mouth and you don't like the texture. Obviously, everybody's very different in terms of what they can tolerate. But if you are not chewing your food well, again, it's going down in bigger pieces. And you might find that then, depending on your stomach acid production and your bioflow production, that then you're getting larger pieces of food potentially entering into small intestines, and you're then ending up with it can sometimes not necessarily slow down motility, but provide an opportunity for bacteria to grow, or we don't have sanitation in the gut. There's lots of things. So I'm going to go from chewing down to stomach. So stomach acid production can be limited by a number of things. So it could be stress. So we're not actually producing stomach acid in large enough quantities to be able to do things like break down protein effectively. And if we don't also then produce enough stomach acid, we don't also then further down. So this is where it's top down. It's kind of like this process. We don't then secrete as much bile that then also helps to break down fats. So this is also then when we can start to find that we are not able to digest foods well, and it can result in pain, bloating, distension. But we can sometimes find that that kind of presents in different areas of the abdomen as well. So yeah, I don't know if that is helpful for like an introductory insight there.
Yeah, for sure. It paints a picture that it's not necessarily a food intolerant, because
Mm.
what I get a lot of clients is thinking they need to cut out specific foods. And don't get me
Mm.
wrong, people do have food intolerances and certain foods don't agree with them and cause bloating. But it's not only that, like you're saying, it's your speed at which you consume food, it's the production of the saliva, it's the acid in your stomach. So slowing down, taking your time having meals, like they're all such important things, managing your stress. So
Mm.
definitely I want to touch on, because what I often hear is phrases like your gut is your second brain, or when you're having good feelings and you get those butterflies, everything is coming from your gut. Can you talk about the connection between our gut and our brain?
Definitely. And it's a really cool one. So there's a couple of different a couple of different connections that we can see. So part of, and it's also interesting that obviously your clients are saying that they've got to cut out certain foods. Just to touch upon that quickly as well, is sometimes the reduction of certain foods can help with symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily address why the symptom was there in the first place. And if you don't address why the symptom was there in the first place, what can then happen is if you reduce your food diversity going in, we can then change the flora in the gut itself. So the way that you've got bacterial colonies and all those sorts of things, you will change the diversity of those. And potentially over time, having a restrictive nutritional approach can actually be detrimental, because whether you've had clients who've experienced this, but one of their previous safe foods now triggers them. And a lot of the time it's because we've changed the ecology in the gut. And we've also not necessarily addressed the underlying cause. So we might be experiencing still gut permeability, increased reactivity, or whether it is a systemic inflammation that is then meaning that the immune system is tagging different metabolites and is then causing further reactions. There's all these sorts of things to consider as well. So it can be a really common thing to start to cut foods out, but you also need a strategy to reintroduce them back in, so that you're able to have as diverse a nutrient intake as possible, so that you can provide all of that pre and probiotic fibers and all the good things that these bacteria want to chomp on to be able to produce things like medium chain fatty acids, which are really important for like gut health and mood and all these sorts of things. So coming back into that as the gut being the second brain. So if we think about it from the perspective of you've got a huge amount of nerve fibers and nerve endings surrounding the gut. So if we're thinking about how the brain interprets the feedback that it receives every single millisecond of every single day, we have got all of these afferent signals from the body going up to the brain. And a lot of the time we are very unaware of that happening. What we'll tend to find is we manifest a certain kind of like feeling instead of like my stomach is not happy. I'm not producing this. I'm not producing that. It'll be more along the lines of, okay, I feel really bloated and I feel a bit, what's going on? And that's because you have got innervations and you've got information coming from the gut going up to the brain. You may also find that you are not digesting food as well, so therefore you maybe don't have the same amount of like nutrient availability, all these sorts of things. So if we're talking about the general overview of that, any change in, let's say, bloating, for example, bloating is going to potentially create stretch feedback in terms of the muscles that are surrounding all of like, you've got obviously your intestines, your small intestines, your large intestines, but they're like muscular tubes as well. You've got muscles around them. They're not necessarily muscular tubes themselves, but they've got muscles around them that help with the movement of food through, because otherwise the food would just stay there. So if you've got a strong stretch receptor kind of like feedback, sometimes that can be manifested as pain, or it can be interpreted as pain, not manifest. Manifest is the wrong word. But a signal that is going back to the brain, that the brain goes, if this muscle stretches any more, this could potentially cause harm over the long term. So I'm actually going to now go, it's painful. Oh, okay. I don't feel good. Oh, okay. I need to move away from what it is that I'm doing. But if we're not able to move away from what it is that we're doing, and it's kind of like a perpetual thing, we have this constant signal going back and we kind of like ignore it, and we kind of like push it down, we suppress it, then we find that our body then tries to tell us with other emotions and other moods and those sorts of things. And, that it's a huge feedback there. If we're looking at it from the perspective of like kind of like emotions and having a gut feeling about something, what we could potentially look at there is the energetics that kind of move around the body. And this is where it goes a little bit woo-woo. And we can look at Chinese medicine, we can look at your chakras and all of these sorts of things, energetic meridians. But again, a lot of the time we tend to find that we've got a lot of our obviously essential organs and essential components to us are in this center. So if we have a sudden chemical reaction or chemical release from the brain, we can then see that, again, certain muscles kind of like contract. We get like a ooh feeling, or it's like a twisty or a knotted sensation. And or even kind of like the butterflies is almost like a nervous excitement. It's like it's the way that our brain has learned to interpret the physiological response of what our body is expressing. So like a little increase in heart rate or a little bit of a mild twist, but it's not like a churning twist, if that makes sense. So there's that side. And then you also have, if we're looking at it from the perspective of kind of like hormonal production or metabolite production in the gut. So you even have a level of your bacteria in your gut can influence the way that you think. I know that that also sounds mad, but if, for example, you potentially find that you have a lot of maybe like sugar cravings, for example, you may have a higher quantity of bacteria in your gut that really likes sugary things and living off of sugary things. So when their population starts to change, they can send signals to then go, oh, eat a little bit more of this. It could also be that you're sleep deprived or you've not eaten in a long time, so therefore you actually genuinely need to eat. But there can be different aspects that kind of like play into these sorts of things.
It's super fascinating how everything is interconnected. Even
Yeah.
all the things that we've spoken about so far, there's a connection between every single thing. And it's important to have that overarching picture when identifying the root cause of why we have certain symptoms and why we feel in a certain way, not just, for example, if we're having a low mood day or just in general being low in mood, like that isn't necessary or brain problem, like it could be coming from our gut as well. So super fascinating. I actually want to take a different route now and go down about speaking on the topic of diet culture because it's something that you help women overcome, as in you help women develop confidence and strength by ditching diet culture trends. So talk to me about some of the toxic diet trends that you tend to see women have or come to you with.
Definitely. So diet culture in itself tends to be the overarching compulsion or the end goal of losing fat mass at any cost. So it's one of these things that it focuses heavily on, let's say, the aesthetic and the outcome, and very little attention on the physiological and psychological health of the person who's maybe going through that process and through that journey. And when we then look at it from, again, this holistic perspective, it's so difficult to sometimes just choose kind of like one aspect. I'll try my best. But some of the common things that I see are unfortunately touted a lot by like social media. I think social media is one of the biggest perpetrators of diet culture and also of the recurrent theme of comparisons and women feeling like they need to look like someone else or be something else in order to feel or achieve success. So if we're looking into different actual like specifics in terms of like fad dieting, anything that really has super restrictive rules, and when I say super restrictive rules, I'm talking about like ifs and when rules. So I can only have this if or when I do a certain action. It's kind of like this like reward or punishment behavior. If we're also looking at diets that cut out complete food groups as well, that can also be something that contributes quite heavily to like disordered eating patterns and behaviors. And I think that that's a big aspect actually, is like diet culture for me is something that is going to either exacerbate or lead into disordered eating patterns and behaviors or body image struggles that you may or may not already have. So examples of that could be keto. It could be intermittent fasting. It could be carnivore. It could be low FODMAP. It could be, to be honest, any specific diet if it has a deleterious effect on the person who is undergoing it. And I know that that is then like, oh, but wait, does that then mean that I can't have guidelines around the foods that I eat? And that's not necessarily like one and the same. It's about the relationship that you have with food, the ability to make choices in alignment with your goals that are based out of choice and empowerment rather than guilt and shame.
So, what would you say are some fundamentals that women should keep in mind when they do want to see a sustainable change? Fat loss, for example, because that's usually when, the diet culture and fad diets come in place. So, what are some of the fundamentals to a sustainable fat loss?
I think a huge part of it has got to be the energetics of change and the energetics of it. So if you are in a position where you feel like life is going to be different when, or life is going to be different if, and this and that and that, we're always projecting forward into a fantasy. Unfortunately, we can only ever live in the present moment. We can never live in the future. So if you are hinging your happiness and your ability to be grounded within yourself and almost like kind of put yourself through a purgatory of very restrictive foods in the hope and pursuit of when, that is often a really big red flag in the sense of it's likely you're going to relapse, because what we're not learning is we're not learning in the here and the now how to regulate ourselves. We're not learning how to incorporate different food groups. We're not learning how to navigate different situations or scenarios. We are putting blanket statements and blanket terms on, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that, or I'm going to not pay attention to auto-regulation. So when it's kind of thinking, what should we look out for? I would say anything that has absolute definitives of you have to follow this, you have to follow that, you have to do this. And also being comfortable with having to learn to sit in sometimes that discomfort of learning flexibility and learning auto-regulation, I think are some really key points.
Yeah, no, that is self-awareness is something
Mm-hmm.
that is definitely a key factor when it comes to making it sustainable for you, because every person is going to have a different approach. We're all individuals. So what works for one person might not necessarily work for another. Look,
Mm-hmm.
Morag, this was a brilliant conversation and we touched on so much there. So, for anyone listening, it'd probably be an episode to re listen back on and take some notes, because there's different avenues we touched. But before we wrap up, what would be the top three things that you would tell somebody that is looking to not only survive, but actually thrive and optimize their
Mm-hmm.
health and well being?
So the first thing that I would say is don't do it alone. I would always get support, and I would always look at a coach who is able to take you through the highs and the lows that you will experience. Because we all like to think that there's going to be this magical point where everything's going to be great and there's going to be no commitments and you're going to have a clear run of it. Unfortunately, that's not realistic. And if we're being realistic, having somebody to talk to through those moments in your support system is huge. And it will be the difference between you relapsing and judging yourself versus being able to talk it through, rationalize, and be logical about what's actually happened, and therefore like the results, and being able to keep going. So that would be definitely the first thing that I would suggest. The second thing I would suggest as well is not just trying to throw everything at yourself at once. I would say like the power of one and the power of not multitasking is huge. I know that as women we're like, right, I can multitask. But the unfortunate thing is if you've got like a browser of 100 windows open, you can only still ever look at one window at a time. You can't look at all 100. So if you have got a lot of things on your plate and you're juggling a lot of different tasks, schedule, set yourself a little bit of a plan, pick one habit and one behavior, and decide to get really good at actioning that and really good at implementing that. I know that we think we need to overhaul everything at once to see results, but we really don't. We just need to choose one habit, because what that will do is it will give you confidence in yourself that you can stand by what you said you would do, and it will then lead into other habits going forward. And you're probably going to feel pretty good about that as well. And if you're going to pick one habit to choose, I would probably pick sleep. But if you're going to go down the road of like, is it nutrition? Is it training? There's not a right choice, but just pick something that feels good for you and feels good and that you can sustain it. Then the third thing would be, if it's accessible to you, I would look at some degree of understanding what's going on for you at a physiological level, especially if you're noticing changes in your cycle, irregularities. If you're noticing that you've got problems with digestion, or you're really not sure if you need to be cutting out certain food groups or those sorts of things, having a strategic plan to be able to understand exactly what's going on for you can be really powerful and really helpful. If that's not accessible for you, or it's not a level that you want to go to, then self-mastery is a huge thing. So being able to understand the feedback that your body is giving you. And that's a really good way to view it, is everything that you get is feedback. It's not signs that you're incapable or signs that you're knackered, so you just never stick at anything or anything like that we tend to attach meaning to. It's always feedback in the sense of the actions that you have taken up to this point has resulted in this outcome. So if this is not an outcome that I feel comfortable with, what actions can I do differently? So that was maybe like a bonus 2-in-1, Martina, but that would be kind of like my thoughts.
Great point. So we have don't do it alone, focus on one habit at a time and be more in tune with yourself, essentially. If people want to learn more about you or about any of the topics we've spoken about today, where can they find you?
They can find me on Instagram. My handle is Morag Brokesbell. I also have the Hive Health Academy. So those are the kind of the main places. The Morag Brokesbell Instagram is probably the key one. And you'd be more than welcome if you're listening back to this and you want to shoot me a message. I love chatting with new people. If you want to check out my content, or if there's anything that you want me to actually specifically create something on, then I'm always open to suggestions as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fantastic.